What's happening, everyone? Hey, welcome back for another episode of the Adventure Box podcast. That's right. Today we're going to be talking about two big changes, two big colonies, Pennsylvania and Maryland. We're actually going to start with Maryland first, and then we'll go into Pennsylvania. The reason why this is so exciting. Oh, okay, actually, before I get into that, I want to tell you this, but we are sponsored by Historical Conquest. It is an amazing game where you can actually use history to have fun. Now, it's not like 70, 80, 90% educational and only like 10% fun. It's actually like 70%, maybe 60% fun and 30 to 40% educational. And why is that? It's because every time you play, you're going to get more into it. Every time you play, you're going to learn more from it. So it's a win-win situation. You're going to have fun because it's just fun. Have you ever heard of like Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh, Magic? Great. Take those three games. Mix it with the board game Risk, world domination, trying to take over the world. So it looks like a card, but you're trying to take over the world. But where every card is historically based, that's Historical Conquest. That's what's so amazing about this game, is that as a card game, it's always different. Every time you play, it's going to be a different game because it depends on when you draw the cards. And your opponent, when they draw the cards, no two games are ever alike. So, that being said, this is a great way of getting excited about history. But now that I've done that, let me get into the meat and potatoes of this thing. So, we are going to be talking about Pennsylvania and Maryland. But before I get there, I wanted to give you a little caveat. I did not mention one of the biggest events that happened in Massachusetts that is essential for people to know. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the Salem witch trials. We're going to start off with the Salem witch trials. Okay, the reason why I didn't mention it last time is because it's not in the early part of the colony. There is part in the curriculum where you can read about it, but we're going to go over it really fast, and then we'll get into Maryland and Pennsylvania. Okay, so the Salem witch trials. What was it? Why was it so important? Well, this is a place where you have the Puritans who... Well, actually, over in England, there was this big witch hunt. Literally, they were going after witches, or people that they thought were called witches. And so this hysteria came over to the colonies. But what happened? So let's just say January 1692. Again, this is 60 years after the colony was started in Massachusetts, Plymouth Colony, that they actually had two young women who started to have really weird behaviors. Now, what was this? It was because, from what I remember of the actual story, is that they got caught doing something they weren't supposed to. What does a child do when they are caught doing something they're not supposed to be doing? First, they deny it. And second, they try to get your mind off of that and make themselves the victim or things like that. It's a childish thing that happens. So Betty Paris and Abigail Williams. Paris is 9 years old. Williams is 11 years old. So Paris is actually the Reverend Sam Paris's daughter. And also the niece is Abigail Williams. So when he starts seeing these things, he calls, "Witch! It's got to be witch!" Actually, I don't know if he actually called out right at that point if it was a witch. But what they did is those girls turned on Tituba, who is a Caribbean slave. As you know, like I said, things changed in different colonies. But by 1692, there was actually slaves were allowed at that point. So a Caribbean slave by the name of Tituba, was interrogated and actually gave up others that supposedly were with her because she said that the devil had come to her one day. And so she basically got all these other people together, including a homeless beggar called Sarah Good. She was a person that wasn't the most liked in the area. Or also Sarah Osborne, who was an elderly, ill woman. And supposedly these were three witches and were arrested at the time. So again, this is February 1692. By March, Tituba confessed to witchcraft, likely under coercion, of course, interrogation, and claimed that the other witches are present in the colony. What does that do? Boom, paranoia everywhere, and everyone has to search out for witches, just like they did in England. and Europe at the time. So it continues to escalate. Not to go through all this information. It's on the curriculum if you want to go see it. But one thing that's very important to understand is this kept going and going and going. Interesting enough, my wife actually has a connection to what was his name? If you know anything about the Salem witch trials, you've heard his name. Oh, he's one of the biggest victims of it, where he actually dies. I can't think of his name. It wasn't planned to actually, but one of these people that were found guilty was actually his wife was also found guilty of witchcraft, and in order to save his family, he said he was a witch. He agreed to saying that he was a witch, but when they had him sign his name, he could not. And now this might be dramatized over time. I don't know if there's an actual written description of this. This is just the tale that goes down. That he would not sign his name. Why? Because he knew he was lying. And it was right after his death. I mean, like literally right after his death, that they found out that the girls were lying, and there was no witches in the area. And so at this point, he's already put to death. I think his wife was pregnant at the time, or such. But his wife survived. But here's the thing that's really sad: when you are considered a witch, all of your land was taken from you. And most of these people died before their land was returned, before Massachusetts returned their property. Very sad. Very sad how it all happened. But that's the story of the Salem witch trials. You can read more about it in the curriculum. It's a great little read. It's not that long because there's so much to cover. If I covered everything in depth, you'd be in this book forever. So we wanted to give you out. Plus we have a page limit, and we'd already hit our page limit, because we had to come back through because we didn't write about it the first time when we were going through. And we were like, wait, where's the Salem witch trials? So that's what happened. Okay, so now going on to something that's even more important is, more important. Yes, more important than Salem witch trials is the discovery of two other colonies. The first one, Maryland. Why was Maryland such a important thing to learn about? Okay, so Maryland, the reason why it is because this was, if you remember English history, which we will go over next year. In English history, you have the Catholics and the Anglicans. You also have the Puritans, the Protestants, and so on and so forth. But you have the Catholics against the Anglicans, which is basically the Church of England. And they're butting heads. They are so butting heads. Because, again, they want to see who's right, but also because of King Henry VIII. King Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wife. He was Catholic. He couldn't divorce his wife. So he creates the Church of England in order to break it apart and actually make it different. So he didn't like how it was governed, so he wanted to make his own church, made it the Church of England. Okay, so that being said, the Catholics are now being persecuted in England. Now, if they went to France, they'd be somewhat fine. And if they, depending on the year, because it changed back and forth, a lot of religious persecution back then. Huge amounts of religious persecution. You think we're bad with persecution here in the United States? That there's racism and stuff like that? Oh, shoot. Check out the religious persecution that was happening. I mean, people were being killed daily. In the United States, you don't see that. You do see people occasionally die from racism, but it's not as prevalent. I mean, you're talking about deaths in the large portions during the year. And so this was a time of great upheaval at that point. So the Catholics, guided by George Calvert, he actually decided, you know what, let's go over to the New World and let's start up a new land. So he attempted to settle Newfoundland, but because of harsh weathers and poor conditions, they left there and went southward. And they actually settled in Maryland. So Maryland is this area. I'll give you a picture that they would have had back then. It would have looked something like this. Whoa, that's just, wow. You have all the detail of all the different rivers and coves and such. So it's really a little bit hard to understand. So let's go back to this one. It's a little bit better. So you have Maryland. Right above it is actual Pennsylvania, which we'll go into in just a little bit. But you have Maryland, and in Maryland, they start having their own colony. So everything's free. It's no persecution here. They were able to establish churches and everything. And so this was great. They are actually able to be happy, have their own, govern their lives as they wanted to, as the Catholic Church, or as Catholic settlers. And then two ships arrived, the Ark and the Dove. They set sail from England in November 1633. Oh, sorry, I should say Calvert had this idea of setting it up in 1629. They arrived in 1632, calling it Maryland, based off of basically Queen Maria, the Catholic wife of King Charles. So, shout out to her. And so, the Ark and the Dove show up 1633, carrying the first settlers, including both Catholic and Protestant. So when they came, they hadn't come over yet. This is, the first part was them finding it. The second, in 1633, with the Ark and the Dove, that's when they actually bring the settlers over. And by bringing the settlers over, they actually bring Catholics and Protestants. And the reason is because they said, we're all being persecuted over in England. Let's come here so we can work together. The problem is that one was over another. Like, there was more Catholics than there was Protestants, and the Protestants felt overwhelmed by that, and there was a fighting back and forth. Okay, so the first settlement is St. Mary's. So they arrive March 1634. The settlers arrive and founded St. Mary. So March. They actually had to leave during the winter, which has been frigid cold, especially on a ship. Okay, so they get there. They set up their first settlement. March, it's getting a little warmer. The colonies starting to prosper. There is a little bit of religious tension between the Catholics and the Protestants, but it's okay. It's not that bad. But the religious tension really starts up around 1642 to 1650, when everyone starts creating these new laws. And you also have the English Civil War. So it is an attempt on colonial politics that basically exasperates or makes it worse, these tensions that are happening. So in 1649, again, this is 15 years later after they arrived, to protect religious conflicts, the Maryland Assembly passes the Act Concerning Religion, also known as the Maryland Tolerance Act. This act granted religious freedom to all Christians, though not to non-Christians, making Maryland one of the first colonies to enact such a legislature. Okay, so they go back and forth, and there's religious tension. As you know, there was religious tension up in Massachusetts as well. We talked about that on Monday. We're going to talk about another one that was happening. Now, the Protestants and the Catholics, there's a lot of revolts, especially nearing the end of the 1600s. And then the restoration of the Calvert control, the Catholic control, was basically in 1615. So it was back and forth. I'm not even going to touch that one. It's just like, there's no winning by picking any kind of sides or even telling about this. Read about it in the curriculum. There's just so much intolerance, even when they started this colony to become tolerant. So, sorry to say that came up. But at the same time, let's go back to England with another group that's being persecuted. Okay, so there's Maryland. Now this is George Calvert. If you have a picture, if you have our YouTube channel, this is George Calvert. But there's another man that was very important at this time. His name was William Penn. And if you know him that well, Penn as in Pennsylvania. Yes, okay. So let's go over Pennsylvania. So William Penn, born in 1644. So well after all these other places are settled. As you just heard, Maryland is well established by 1644. 1656, Quakerism emerges. There's George Fox, who basically created the Religious Society of Friends, also known as the Quakers. So they enrolled, so William Penn joined the Quakers, leaving his Catholic or Protestant background, leaving one of the backgrounds, and joined the Quakers. His father, though, was well respected in England. He was so well respected that he owned land in Ireland, and the government actually owed him a ton of money and favors. So William Penn and his father always butted heads. They continually butted heads. And at one point, William Penn is thrown into the Tower of London. While he's in the Tower of London, his dad comes to him and says, "Please, will you stop this Quakerism so that you can be released?" And his son says, "No, I will not give up my beliefs, even if I have to stay here the rest of my life." And his father actually leaves and actually gains respect for him. So much respect that he goes to the king, who again owes William Penn's father a great deal of money. And he says, "Please let him go. And if you let him go, I will try to get him." Well, sorry. I don't actually think that his father was part of it. It was William Penn that later came on and said, "You know all this money that you owe me? Why don't you give me part of the New World? Just give me any section of this place, and I will make that my home, and we will settle all of our debts. You won't owe my father anything, who's now dead. You won't owe me anything, because I'm gone." Well, funny enough, he actually doesn't actually leave. He goes back and forth. But the king says, "Okay, I will do that." Wipes out his debt. Settles his debt. Okay. So at this point, it's 1681. So as you know, Maryland's already been there for a while. Virginia's been there for a while. Massachusetts has been there for a while. This is when he was, 37 years old. So at 37 years old, he has all this debt, and he decides, you know what? I'm going to go settle the New World. He names, the land is named Pennsylvania, meaning Penn's Woods, which is actually an honor not to him, but to his father, Admiral Penn. And so he creates this great society over here, or what he wants to create a society. He brings as many Quakers as will go with him, and they settle Pennsylvania. But what I'm going to show you next is really interesting. This is how he received Pennsylvania. So they embark on their journey 1682. So he embarks with a lot of Quakers, not as many as will be going there, but at that point. So he goes over and he settles in the very tip of actually what would be considered like New Jersey right now. And so he comes in, and the first thing that happens with getting this new land is he meets up with, that's right, he meets up with a native tribe, the Delaware tribe. So Penn entered into a treaty with them, the treaty with the Lenape Native Americans. So the Delaware tribe, basically, but it's the groups. There's different groups that are there. So they established peace and relationships and a way of purchasing land fairly with the Native Americans, or the natives. Well, they would have been Native Americans at that time, which earned them respect. And so at that point, William Penn says, "This is great. Everything's going well. I'm going to leave my people here. I'm going to go back and get some more people. Because now we have this way of working with the natives. And we get this land." Again, 1682, right here. And because of that treaty, he gets 1683, right here. And when he leaves, he establishes one more area, 1684. Okay, that's great. Things are happening. Yes, things are happening. This is basically as far as William Penn gets, 1684. So, at this point, Penn's first wife dies around 1696. While I think he's actually in England at the time. So he returns to Pennsylvania. He doesn't return until 1699. He left 1684 returns 1699. He has an estate there. He has people working his estate. So he has this estate in Pennsylvania, and he has this estate over in England. But this is where basically he returns to Pennsylvania, and Penn grants the Charter of Privileges, providing greater self-governance, which basically gives religious freedom to this area. So actually, a lot of people from Maryland are trickling into this area because there's freedom. And Penn says, I don't want people fighting. Quakerism was never created for intolerance. So he has basically these 3 plots of land, small portion of Pennsylvania. So actually, during this time, he wants to buy more of the land. So he actually gives up parts of New Jersey to claim more of Pennsylvania. Then he actually talks to the king about giving him more of the area, charting more. And so he's able to create more of Pennsylvania. He never actually gets to see the whole thing put together. He actually dies. He makes this purchase right here. His last purchase, 1718. It's basically when he died. This was the one that was granted to him. So he only had a small portion of Pennsylvania, and he had a large estate. Now, there's something that you need to know about William Penn. Okay, William Penn did own slaves. He did. He's like most people during that time. We've talked about it a lot of times. But he did own slaves. But here's something to understand about him. He was never about ownership of slaves. He actually writes about it. In Quakerism, you don't. Quakers do allow for it, but there's a lot of back and forth when it comes to the rest of Pennsylvania and allowing to have slaves or not have slaves. William Penn does something great at this point. And I'd say it's great because it has to be done this way. In current law in Pennsylvania, you can't just release slaves, people from Africa. You cannot just release them and say, you're free. It doesn't work that way. But if you die and they're still in your servitude, you can grant them freedom. And in his will, he granted all of his slaves, all the people that served him in Pennsylvania, even though he wasn't even there, all the people that were managing this land, he broke it up and said, it's all yours. He gave certain portions to each of them because he did not, this might be said different ways and people have different things, but if you read some of his writings, you can actually learn he was not for slavery. He did not like the idea of slavery. And his idea was that he was able to keep these people safe, not being able to be owned by anyone else. And at the time that he was done with life, that they would all have part of his land. And he separated it between them. Now, there's also some questions of what actually happened after that. Because, again, politics, land, power, money, those type of things come in. And there was potentially a change in his will at some point. They're not quite sure what had happened, but he was not even there at the time. So I don't actually know what happened at the end because I don't think they have writing on exactly what happened at the end when it came to his land and his slaves. But that was still in his will, which we have the documentation of it. So this is really interesting. There were actually people who, in their own mentality, again, you cannot see it from your point of view that you have right now. You can learn from the mistakes that they would have made per your point of view, but if you want to learn history, you have to learn it from their perspective. And most of these people, well, I won't say most of these people, there's a good amount of people that were actually having slaves because if they didn't buy them here, if they didn't buy them, somebody else was going to, and they would probably have been abusing them because African Americans or Africans at the time were not allowed to be free at the time, except for certain things, such as if the quote-unquote master dies. If the master dies and grants them land, they are now landowners, and they are granted their freedom. At that point, because they have land, they can actually vote. They can actually have different rights that they would never have had. So this is why there's a lot of things to slavery, more than just these people enslave these people. They're evil. They should be mocked. They should be criticized. They should be ruined. Their memory should be ruined, because it's not true. And I'm not defending slavery whatsoever. I think it's the most evil institution ever established. But that's looking at it from my point of view. That's coming from our perspective now. Back then, it wasn't about that. So another thing that's also somewhat controversial is what happened to the Native Americans. When settlers came in, they had to take up land because they had to grow. So look at Pennsylvania. All of these portions of Pennsylvania were actually purchased from the native tribes all the way until the last purchase, which happened in 1874. All of these are purchases. So the Albany Purchase after reduction. So 1754, remember this is right after the French and Indian War and just before the, I think it's actually right about the time of the French and Indian War. And then 1776 is when the American Revolution started. So this large portion happened right before, and again, 1874, that was way after. So they're slowly buying up land from the Native Americans, and you can see how you want to see it. I'm not going to tell you how you should exactly see it, but if you want to be able to see it the most openly and understanding of all the different people that played a part in it, you need to be able to remember to watch it from their perspective. Okay, they had a good relationship with the Native Americans. Give and take. There were some hard times with them. They purchased these pieces of property, maybe for things that weren't that valuable to the English, but they were very valuable to the Native Americans, which is why they accepted those purchases. Some were not. Some were actually under pressure. And I can't say anything to that. We have to go through all the different cases of all these different purchases. I'm not going to, because this is supposed to be a brief overview. This is supposed to be for, again, middle school and high school ages. You can even read this at elementary school, though it's going to be a little above your head. English, or for middle school and high school, you're not going to need to know this information. But do know that it's not as dry and cut as you stole land, because you didn't. A lot of times, there was some stealing land on both the Native American side and the colonial side. Native American to Native American, colonial to Native American. There's a lot of this going on. So you can't really see it from our perspective. Or maybe you don't have the same perspective as some people do. You have to be able to see it from their point of view. Because this will also give you the understanding and the knowledge that you're learning from having both perspectives. Because what's going to happen is, if you can learn it from their perspective, you can have empathy for the people on both sides. And you don't judge either side, because it happened so long ago and happened for different reasons. Now, if there was killing, yeah, you can somewhat judge that. But if there's deals that are made, you can't make that kind of judgment. If there's abuse in slavery, I don't think there's ever a reason. Even back then, there was never a reason for that. Now, slavery in people's minds was an okay thing because they had grown up with it. So this is one thing that you always learn about. Then you take that knowledge of what they felt like and you go to today. Okay, so I don't like the fact that they had slaves. So should we ever have slaves in this day? No, we shouldn't. And we're going to learn from the problems and issues and controversies and everything that happened back then, and we're going to make it to what we understand today. There should never be slaves. Now, there never should be African slaves, people from Africa, or black slaves or anything like that. But what about slaves today? Are there slaves today? There are slaves today. Have you ever seen slaves today? Most likely not, especially in the United States. Go to Brazil, you'll see slavery. Go to the black market, you'll see slavery. You see slavery all over the place in the mentality that people get. Our idea of liberty and independence is being free and clear from all other influences outside of what we believe that should be there. Now, at the same time, there are laws that are established. And if you want to overturn those laws, you do it the legal way. You go to vote. You go to work in government, become a legislator, and work in the legislation. Become a legislator, work on as a legislature, and work on the legislation. I love that. That's the English language. Okay, but I'm going to end it here. I appreciate you being here for this time where we can talk about these two great colonies. And I say great because they're the start of the United States. And a lot of times people will say, hey, these were evil things that happened during them. Yes, they were wrong things that were happening back then. But don't judge a book by its cover. Don't judge someone just because of an act that was taught to them by generations before them. Learn about the person. Figure out who the person is. And then if you want to think that way, go for it. I'm not going to tell them anything different. But try not to see it from your own perspective. Try to see it from their perspective first. And then learn what you can learn from it in these days with your perspective. And map the perspective based off of that as well. Okay, I'm going to leave you there. This was great to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining us on this Adventure Box podcast, and we will catch you next time. Take care. Bye-bye. If I can turn this thing off. Bye-bye. If you have any comments or questions, add them to the comments below. Otherwise, we'll see you tomorrow, actually. Take care. Bye.